Thanks very much for inviting me. Yeah, my name's Iain Davis. I'm a writer, researcher and author. I live in the UK. My website is iandavis.com. I've got the Scottish spelling of Ian. It's IAIN Davis.com. I've been writing and researching most of my life, but I've been doing it kind of in earnest for about the last 8 or 9 years, I think. So I'm very fortunate that I've had the opportunity to work with some great people. I worked with, most recently, I've been working with Whitney Webb on a series looking at sustainable development goals and more broadly, the sustainable development agenda. And that's something that I believe that we're going to talk about today. And I'm also fortunate to write for Geopolitics and Empire with Hervé Moric and with the UK column as well. And my work is often syndicated in outlets like OffGuardian and so forth. So that's me. And, I think it's really important to discuss sustainable development because I think the general kind of perception of what it's really about is largely misunderstood in my view. So I'm currently writing a series of articles with Whitney Webb about about sustainable development, and we're looking at each of the 17 sustainable development goals. And the URL for that's on the screen. The reason that we're doing that is because we're both of the opinion that most people don't really understand perhaps some of the details that are of sustainable development or the reasons why sustainable development is being pushed globally. So our series is called Sustainable Debt Slavery, and the reasons why we've called it that will become apparent. So the UN's, as we said, they've got 17 goals, and normally the way that we perceive those 17 goals, if you go onto the UN's website, the amount of information that is immediately available to you is the best way to describe that would be marketing information. So this is this is the image of sustainable development goals without giving you any detail about how they actually function. Now, in order to get that detail, then you really need to start looking at the documents a lot, and nearly all the documentation that we've cited in our series, which if you go to Unlimited Hangout, you'll be able to see all the links. They're all available in all the articles that we've written. I think we've done 4 so far. So you could verify the information, but most of that information is coming from United Nations documentation. So the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is pitched very much as a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet now and into the future. So that's the concept that most people understand it to be. And again, most people think that they tackle the problems allegedly wrought by the so-called climate disaster. But in fact, only SDG 13 deals specifically with climate mitigation. The rest covers every other aspect of our lives, and it is every other aspect of our lives. There is no corner of our normal everyday existence that there isn't a related sustainable development goal, target, or indicator for. Now, we started looking at it, we started with SDG 17, because SDG 17 is what they call Partnership for Goals. And that establishes something called the multi-stakeholder partnerships, which are promoting sustainable development goals. Now, the multi-stakeholder partnerships are partnerships between government, between intergovernmental organizations like the UN, between private philanthropic foundations such as the Rockefeller Foundation and the Gates Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and so forth, international corporations, global corporations, other institutions such as the World Economic Forum, also non-governmental organizations like Greenpeace and so forth and Wellcome Trust, and then also organizations, like civil society, what they call civil society members. So, for example, with interested groups in conservation groups and stuff like that at a more local level. But this is the key to the point that most people don't grasp about sustainable development. It isn't so much about transitioning to a new kind of way of managing the climate or anything like that, or managing environment. It's very much based on economic, financial, and monetary development. This is key to sustainable development. This, again, comes from one of the documentation, comes directly from UN documentation. The idea of SDG 17, its aim, is to enhance global macroeconomic stability, including through policy coordination and policy coherence. So that's policy coordination and policy coherence at a global level. To enhance global partnerships for sustainable development, and that's complemented by the multi-stakeholder partnerships, which, as I just described, to support the achievement of sustainable development goals in all countries. So this is global. Encourage and promote effective public-private partnerships and civil society partnerships, building on the experience and resourcing strategies of partnership. So it's very much about partnership working. And, a lot of people might say, well, what's wrong with that? There's no problem with that. Key to how this is all going to work is financial transformation, because in order for sustainable development goals to be implemented, there needs to be a financing package that enables that transformation to take place, because we're talking about transforming so much of what we currently do every day. So according to the UN Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, multi-stakeholder partnership means, and this is directly from them, partnership between businesses, NGOs, governments, the United Nations, and other actors, global corporations as well. These multi-stakeholder partnerships are supposedly working to create global macroeconomic stability as a prerequisite for the implementation of SDGs. So you need their new framing of macroeconomic stability in order to implement the SDGs. So the UN Department for Economic and Social Affairs, which is UNDESA, have effectively redefined macroeconomic stability, because what we used to mean, and what most economists still talk about it in these terms, is full employment and stable economic growth accompanied by low inflation. Most of us would consider that to be economic stability. But now they're introducing this idea of fiscal balance, or they're developing the idea of fiscal balance, which is the difference between a government's revenue and its expenditure, which is normal. That's what fiscal balance normally is. But it must now accommodate sustainable development by increasing what they're calling the fiscal space. So UNDESA, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, suggests that this fiscal space depends upon what they're calling the debt sustainability gap. So it defines this as the difference between a country's current debt level and its estimated sustainable debt level. But that's based on a model. It's a calculation, because no one knows what events may impact future economic growth. So the debt sustainability gap is a theoretical model. This effectively disassociates the term macroeconomic stability from real economic activity, because you're introducing this conceptual model of what future growth could be like given a certain set of inputs to your model, whatever those inputs might be. But as we've seen recently, if there's a war breaks out in Europe, or if there's a large financial institution start to collapse, as we are seeing, then that's going to affect, that may not have been an input into your model. So this future projection of the debt sustainability gap is, I would suggest, pretty much a nonsense. And this is crucial. So this is what the World Bank considers to be the basis for financing sustainable development, is that debt is a critical form of financing for sustainable development goals. So sustainable development is a global policy initiative affecting every corner of our lives, as we've discussed, but it's based upon the notion of ever greater financing. So that means additional debt, especially for developing nations, and this is needed to protect us from the ravages of the alleged climate breakdown. So what they're saying is that unless countries act based on this theoretical model of how much it's going to cost, the debt sustainability gap, that they have to commit to this debt, they have to commit to this financing, because the alternative costs of the impacts of climate change would be worse. We've just seen that, I think, in the US at the Senate hearing committee, where the secretary was asked to say how much is it going to cost. So for the US, they're estimating maybe around $50 trillion maybe for the transition. And what will be the net gain of that in terms of climate change. How many degrees of warming is that $50 trillion worth of investment going to stop? He couldn't answer that question because it's all based on theoretical models, as is the climate risk. That is also based on theoretical models. But what isn't based on theoretical models is the amount of financing that they're putting into it and the amount of money that's going into it. So I've just put a quote on here from George Orwell. Real power is achieved when the ruling class control the material essentials of life, granting and withholding them from the masses as if they were privileges. So a very important aspect of sustainable development is this, what they're calling the financialization of nature. So things like rivers become, water services for human settlements. Things like forests become things like carbon sequestration services. So they're taking what they're calling the global commons, which is all the things that life depends upon but no one owns, which is probably the broadest definition of it, or the most common definition of it. And they're licensing those things. So there would be license applications for example, a forest, which would provide a service, which is a carbon sequestration service. This is set within the new sustainable development global economy. And what that means is that you can then trade and barter and sell access to those licenses. So if I'm a logging company and I want to cut the forest down, I'm going to have to negotiate with the license holder, despite the fact that, and this is key, this is creating new markets, despite the fact that nobody actually may or may not own that forest. It's not just about buying the land, it's about buying access to the resource. And that is the basis for the new economic system that they're trying to build with SDGs. So SDG implementation, and this goes for all countries. It won't just be the developing nations; it'll be developed nations as well. So SDG implementation through IMF loans and the World Bank and the associated multilateral development banks. The financing will incur the planned debt obligations. So I've deliberately said planned because obviously if you're increasing national debt or using debt restructuring, which is something that is quite common to finance sustainable development for any country, then it's a planned debt obligation. You are planning for that country to be in debt or for that government to be in debt. So by restructuring repayment options will include such mechanisms as debt for conservation swaps. This is something that has been talked about quite a lot, or debt for climate swaps, which what that boils down to is land grabs and resource grabs, and it might even be the ocean. So someone's access to the ocean, their coastal waters or whatever. Essentially, land grabs and land resource theft on a scale we've never before seen anything like this. So this is multinational corporations, mainly the banks, who are working with the IMF and the World Bank to do things like these debt for climate swaps. So there's a couple of examples of how they will work. So as we can see, what the point of that is that if you're, say, in a debt for nature swap, you're creating a conservation project, which that conservation project will be licensed because they're going to license everything called the global commons. So there'll be some negotiation, a contractual arrangement about the licensing of, for example, a mountain range or part of a mountain range or whatever it might be. That land will be set aside for its purpose, its designated purpose, which will be a sustainable development goal purpose. Perhaps, we hear a lot about things like rewilding. So it will be set aside for that. There'll be a license that has to be paid in order to do that. The government or the local authority or whoever, there'll be a contractual arrangement to pay for that. So, and that will be financed through things like IMF loans, World Bank loans and IMF lending and so forth. So that's the process of building up this new kind of economic model. Instead of traditional things like gas and coal and let me also add that those things will also continue. Gas and coal, that will continue. So will continue being sold. Access to those natural resources will continue being profitable. In fact, as it becomes scarcer, they'll become increasingly more profitable. But you're also creating, by creating these natural assets, you're also creating new tradable commodities on a global scale. So that's a big a big enticement, I would say, for the investors to get into sustainable development. So it's very much about using debt, okay, using debt as a way of controlling policy and as a way of controlling governments and as a way of controlling us as well, ultimately. So this is very interesting. This is something that Whitney discovered, that in 2008, a leaked US Army document, Field Manual FM 305.130, which was the Army Special Operations Forces for Unconventional Warfare, listed the World Bank and the IMF as both financial instruments and diplomatic instruments of US national power, as well as an integral part of what the manual calls the current global governance system. So this is creating also a framework for real global governance, i.e. giving global governance some real teeth, because this SDG and sustainable development policy will be enforceable at the national level. So the World Bank and the IMF have already been brought under the control of a new international power structure specifically set up for sustainable development called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. That was announced at COP21. It's an alliance of 450 financial institutions so far, representing currently around $130 trillion in assets. So these are companies like BlackRock and banks like HSBC and Citigroup and people like this. So it's announced the plan to overhaul. It's already announced its plan to overhaul the role of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The aim is to transform, quote, the global financial system. And recently, BlackRock's CEO, Larry Fink, reiterated the intention, quote, if we're going to be serious about climate change in the emerging world, we're going to have to really focus on reimagining the World Bank and the IMF. So going back to the World Bank statement that sustainable development goals will be financed through debt, this is what Fink is talking about. So, and what that ultimately will lead to, so GFANZ, again, this is all openly stated by them, GFANZ aims to construct a new system of, quote, global financial governance. So this is about changing our existing international monetary and financial system as well, in addition to this new system of global financial governance, which is based on things like ESGs, which is a rating system that they'll apply to rate something, an investment, as either sustainable or not sustainable. And that will be set. And again, this is centrally controlled by bodies like GFANZ. So they will have control of this system. To this end, GFANZ has formed numerous multi-stakeholder alliances. This brings private multinational corporations into the Sustainable Development Goal finance structure. For example, UN's Net Zero Banking Alliance affords Citigroup, Deutsche Bank, JP Morgan, HSBC, and others the opportunity to pursue their ideas about how SDGs should be implemented alongside the IMF and the World Bank. So these private companies will have, and private partners of the United Nations and the IMF and the World Bank will have some input and quite a lot of influence over how sustainable development goals policies are rolled out by governments in national states. So they will be controlling policy to an increasing extent as we roll out sustainable development. They'll be in charge of the policy, the design of the policy. National governments, not so much. They'll just be in charge of implementing it. But national governments are also partners within this network. So this is one network. The multi-stakeholder global governance system aiming to transform the global financial system under the guise of sustainable development. So that's reiterating more or less of what I just said. So this is obviously changing the role of government. Government is not, in the new world of sustainable development, governments are not what we think they are. They're partners within a network. They're not leading so much on policy, certainly not on policy development. And I think it's important to realize that sustainable development will reach into every corner of our lives. So even things like health policy, defense policy, national security, even that comes under the umbrella. There's a sustainable development goal for all of that. So it's all encompassing. And this is really important. In 1998, then UN General Secretary Kofi Annan told the World Economic Forum's Davos Symposium that the UN had undergone what he called a quiet revolution. And this is a quote. This is what he said. Quote, "The United Nations has been transformed. The organization has undergone a complete overhaul that I have described as a quiet revolution. A fundamental shift has occurred. The United Nations once dealt only with governments, but now we know that peace and prosperity cannot be achieved without partnerships involving governments, international organizations, the business community, and civil society. The business of the United Nations involves the businesses of the world." So then there was a follow-up resolution that came after that, shortly after that, which added that the UN would maintain, quote, "the strong political commitment to address the challenges of financing and creating an enabling environment at all levels for sustainable development, particularly with regard to developing partnerships through the provision of greater opportunities to the private sector, non-governmental organizations, and civil society in general, in particular in pursuit of sustainable development." So what they're talking about, as I've just alluded to, is that this idea of putting private enterprise at the heart of effectively a policy development. So private enterprise has a greater say in the rollout of policy at national government and a local government level. Government's role within this is to create what they call the enabling environment, which is the regulatory and investment environment to enable private investors to come in to fund sustainable development. Now, I think it's fair to say that, people like BlackRock, investment firms like BlackRock, which are heavily committed to sustainable development, their bottom line is to their shareholders, not to people living in communities that are affected by sustainable development policy. So they are going to be effectively shaping the policy that will impact people in their local area, but they're not doing so necessarily doing so in the best interests of the people that live in that area. They're doing it in the best interests of their shareholders. So that's an important aspect of sustainable development that people need to be aware of. So the enabling environment is a government and therefore taxpayer-funded regulatory and financial commitment to enable the, quote, multi-stakeholder partners to implement SDG policies globally. This creates the so-called fiscal space that we were talking about earlier. So it's important to remember that this is based on a theoretical model of something they're calling the debt sustainability gap. So at COP26, which was not the last conference of parties, but the one before in the UK, in preparation for GFANZ announcements, King Charles III said, quote, "My plea today is for countries to come together to create the environment that enables every sector of industry to take the action required. We know this will take trillions, not billions of dollars. We also know that countries, many of whom are burdened by growing levels of debt, simply cannot afford to go green. Here we need a vast military-style campaign to marshal the strength of the global private sector with trillions at its disposal, far beyond global GDP, beyond even the governments of the world's leaders. It offers the only real prospect of achieving fundamental economic transition." So that there, when King Charles now, when he said that, he's absolutely right. I mean, companies, to a certain extent, he's right about the fact that companies like BlackRock, BlackRock's got something like 10 or how many $10 trillion under investment management. It's got a bigger turnover than the GDP of even developed nations like the UK. So these private financiers, so we're talking about the philanthropic foundations like Bezos and Gates and the Rockefellers and so forth, and, Midyat and people like that. They're the ones that for whom this is going to be an investment opportunity. They're not going to be interested in it if they don't get a return on their investment. These people don't function in that way. They function when they get a return on investment. If they're going to lose money doing it, of course they're not going to do it. So when King Charles is talking about those people funding sustainable development, which is what he's talking about, and that's going to be done through debt mechanisms, the beneficiary of those debt mechanisms is going to be the investors, the private investors. It's not going to be, certainly not going to be the nation states that are in penury as a result. And that's not surprising, really, when we think about it, because obviously this policy agenda is coming from the UN, because the UN itself began as, and has always really been, what we could call a global public-private partnership. So just reading from this slide, the UN was created in no small measure thanks to the efforts of the Rockefeller Foundation, whose comprehensive financial and operational support for the Economic, Financial and Transit Department, EFTD, of the League of Nations, and its considerable influence, then subsequent considerable influence from the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRRA. Through this, the RF was the key player in the transition for the Rockefeller Foundation was the key player in the transition of the League of Nations to the UN. Basically, what the Rockefellers did was they funded what became the administration of the UN, the kind of like the secretariat part. They're no longer, now that is funded by voluntary contribution by the member nation states, but without the Rockefellers first putting the impetus in to design this system, it probably wouldn't exist. So it is fair to say that the Rockefellers were perhaps the key single entity in the creation of the United Nations back in 1948. So in 2000, the Executive Committee of the UN Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, published a private sector involvement and cooperation within the United Nations system report, in which it said, quote, "The United Nations and private sector have always had extensive commercial links through the procurement activities of the former, the United Nations. The United Nations market provides a springboard for a company to introduce its goods and services to other countries and regions. The private sector has also long participated directly or indirectly in the normative and standard setting work of the United Nations." So, going back to what we've just been talking about, sustainable development goals, this is a continuation of that UNESCO were talking about in 2000. It's creating new markets. Now, if you're a partner of the United Nations, which groups like Citibank, for example, are, or the Rockefeller Foundation or the Gates Foundation, if you're a partner of the United Nations, then you've got input into the regulation that is stemming out of their policy agendas. So if you can regulate your own market, which is the really kind of enticing aspect of it for investors, then of course you're going to be able to create a fantastic investment environment for yourself. And that is how the UN is currently operating with respect to sustainable development. But interestingly enough, so this idea of global public-private partnership, in 2016, the body that kind of does the research, the kind of research body for the UN, UNDESTA, looked at the actual benefit of global public-private partnerships and how that worked, even for things like sustainable development. And what it found, quote, "Claims of reduced costs and efficiency delivered of services through global public-private partnerships to save taxpayers money and benefit consumers were mostly empty and ideological assertions. Global public partnership projects were more costly to build and finance, provided poorer quality services, and were less accessible. Moreover, many essential services were less accountable to citizens than when private corporations were involved. Investors in global public-private partnerships faced a relatively benign risk. Penalty clauses for non-delivery by private partners are less rigorous, and the study questioned whether risk was really being transferred to the private partners in these projects. The evidence suggests that global public-private partnerships have often tended to be more expensive than the alternative of public procurement, while in a number of instances they have failed to deliver the envisaged gains in the quality of service provision." So there's no doubt that introducing private profit, obviously, I mean, this is what people talk about the impacts of the privatisation of health services, for example, in the UK. Introducing that profit element tends not to deliver a better outcome for us, the people. So the UN's commitment to this model for sustainable development is ideological. It is not based on evidence. The UN's own documentation suggests that these kind of public-private partnerships are only useful really for kind of some infrastructure projects like building bridges or dams. They're not really useful for doing things like rolling out sustainable development across the world. But that is what it is based on. That the UN have decided that, and their partners have decided that that's what it will be based on. So what does that look like? How does this work? So if we take sustainable development or sustainable development goals as a policy platform, a policy agenda, how does this system work? So I've offered a model I've called the Global Public-Private Partnership, which is something that has been written about quite extensively by others. There's a very interesting paper by a couple of researchers called Buse and Walt who have spoken about this. But how does this fit into the kind of global structure? So you've got at the very top, I would suggest, you've got the financial sector. So I've put the Bank of International Settlements, the central bank of central banks, and the central banks very near the top of this power structure. So they're behind GFANZ and these kind of investment and financing vehicles that are funding this transition to a new global economy. So they work in partnership very much with other groups that develop, we might call the policy makers. So we might look at the think tanks, such as the Club of Rome, who came up with the idea of global warming. That's in their Limits to Growth. Or was it the second? I can't remember which one it was, Limits to Growth. But then you've got other think tanks like Chatham House and the Rocket. And then you've got the people like the World Economic Forum. So these are the kind of people who are developing policy agendas. They're not laying down in hard and fast law what the policy will be at a national level, but they're coming up with a trajectory. So if we look at sustainable development, if we sit back and look at sustainable development broadly as a policy trajectory, then it's clear that if we look at the history of how that came from, that we've got to look at people like Maurice Strong and his links to the Rockefellers, the Club of Rome and so forth. These are the people that came together to develop the policy agenda of sustainable development. So once that's set, then you have organizations like the policy distributors. How does this get disseminated out globally or simultaneously? So then that's where organizations, I would argue, like the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, obviously the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, World Bank, WHO, the philanthropists, global corporations, and the NGOs, who are called the quote unquote multi-stakeholder partners, they come together to start distributing that policy globally. So they make investments and they drive policy discussions, they promote policy platforms in countries all over the world. Then we get down to what I've called the policy enforcers. So that's where national government comes in, because it's national government that has got the job. And actually recently the article that Whitney and I are working on at the moment, we found some quotes directly where that is openly admitted, that the role of government is to transition and to transform policy agendas into policy. The UN openly state that. Unfortunately, I haven't cited that in this presentation, but please, be aware of that for our next piece that's coming out, because we do discuss that. So this is openly admitted. Really, government is reduced to the enabling partner. It creates the regulatory and fiscal environment in order to encourage private investors to come in and profit from sustainable development agendas. They then so that regulation, obviously, that has to come from policy, and that's what government does. Then we got the policy propagandists. So who's going to convince us to go for something like net zero policy? In the UK, we have net zero policy. If we look at the implications of net zero policy, that means that we've all got to reduce our energy usage hugely, massively. We've all got to be driving around in electric vehicles, when all the evidence suggests that there is nowhere near enough resources on Earth for everybody to be doing that. So we're going to have to give up some of our freedoms in terms of transportation and so forth. Most people won't be able to afford an electric vehicle. Most people won't be able to afford the energy prices as they continue to escalate because of scarcity. Because if we're not mining the coal, if we're not extracting the gas, if we're not mining the oil, then it becomes more scarce. The unit cost goes up, and that has a knock-on effect to everybody. So energy costs go up and so forth. So how are we going to be convinced? Things like, farming, sustainable development is all about reducing farming in developed nations. I mean, there's got all these rewilding projects and so forth that are taking away perfectly usable farmland from food production. Food prices are going to go up. But how are we going to be convinced to buy into that? Well, that's where the propagandists come in. So we're talking about the mainstream media, the fact checkers, the social media platforms as well. Then there's legislation that's going to make it, I would suggest things like the Online Safety Bill in the UK and the European Directive on Online Harms and all these kind of things. They're going to make it increasingly difficult for anybody to question any of this stuff. We already commonly hear the term climate denier and things like that. So, if people question what we're talking about today, we'll probably be labelled as climate deniers. That'll be considered harmful, so we'll be censored. So this is becoming an increasing component of disseminating the belief that something has to be done to save us from the climate emergency, where really what they want to sell is a complete economic restructuring. That's what they're really talking about. And we're the subjects of that, the public. So how could we sum this up in summation? And this is the conclusion to the article that this presentation is based upon, so I'll just read it. Sustainable development has been integrated with every policy decision. Not only does every country have a national sustainability plan, these have devolved to local government. It is a global strategy to extend the reach of global financial institutions into every corner of the economy and society. Policy will be controlled by the bankers and the think tanks that infiltrated the environmental movement decades ago. No community is free of global financial governance. Simply put, sustainable development supplants decision-making at the national and local level with global governance. It is an ongoing and thus far successful global coup. Developing nations will be kept in penury as the fruits of modern industrial and technological development are denied to them. Instead, they will be burdened with the debt foisted upon them by the global centres of financial power, their resources pillaged, their land stolen, their assets stripped, and all in the name of sustainability. Yet it is perhaps the financialisation of nature inherent to sustainable development that is the greatest danger of all. The creation of natural asset classes, converting forests into carbon sequestration initiatives, water sources into human settlement services, and so on. SDGs have the financialisation of nature at their core. As openly stated by the UN, sustainable development is all about transformation, not necessarily sustainability, as most people conceive it. It aims to transform the earth and everything on it, including us, into commodities, the trading of which will form the basis of a new global economy. Though it is being sold to us as sustainable, the only thing this new global financial system will sustain is the power of a predatory financial elite. And I've sometimes written about them, calling them the parasite class.
I really enjoyed that. That was very good stuff. How can we fight this? What's the best way to stop this terrible stuff from happening?
Well, I think it's very important to spread awareness, and I'm really glad to have this opportunity on your show to be able to, contribute to that. And I think it's really important, looking at your work, that people like us keep speaking up, because most people have got no idea that this stuff is happening. Most people just see the kind of headlines of sustainable development, which is, the fluffy sound bites and that kind of stuff. So if we want to stop this, raising awareness is really important, because more people need to know about it first. But then we just don't have to accept what we're being told and stick to challenging, obviously basing that challenge on evidence and basing that challenge on kind of the scientific evidence and so forth. I mean, one of the things that I think that would be important is whenever we are told that the consensus is to reject that, because we know that's not true. There isn't a consensus. There's perhaps a majority that are following along, but there's no consensus on climate science. It's a very, very complex area of science, and there's a lot of discussion because that's the nature of science. You know, the basis of science is doubt, not certainty. So you know, I think we don't have to get into the minutiae of the intricacies of the science itself. We can simply point out that denying debate and censoring people is indicative of hiding something. So, you know, using terms like climate denier to stop people speaking about climate science is, you know, indicative of a scam, basically, which when you look at SDG, the plan is what it looks like. That's what it looks like, a financial scam. That's what it appears to be. First and foremost, but I would also say it's also a control agenda as well, because it is very much about controlling our lives. So we've just got to stop going along with this stuff, stop listening to the propaganda without acknowledging that it is propaganda. It's still important to listen to information and to hear what everybody has to say. But we need to understand that everything that comes from some organizations, I would say, for example, the IPCC and members of some parts of the United Nations and our own governments, is often tinged with a heavy spoon of propaganda. So we need to be more self-reliant, think critically about everything, question everything, research everything ourselves, because we're not going to be told by the mainstream media about any of this, and make up our own minds and raise our voices where we can.
In one of your last slides, you were talking about the enormous power of the central banks. What do you think about Bitcoin, for example, as challenging that? Do you think there's a chance that will reduce the power of central banking?
I think we're at a very dangerous point, actually, because of central bank digital currency, which is something that certainly every developed nation around the world is developing. Central bank digital currency is a very, and again, central bank digital currency is linked to sustainable development as well. That's something else that Whitney and I are looking at the moment. If that comes in, then that will massively enhance the power of the central banks. It will make them pretty much in charge, really. I mean, they really will be setting policy. I mean, the idea of financial exclusion for people that rock the boat too much, we've already seen that in Russia. We've seen it in Canada, you know, where people that are politically dissident, for example, just have access to their money switched off. That CBDC enables that to be done on an individual case-by-case basis at the flick of a switch. So that kind of control in the hands of central bankers is very worrying. And we really need to be resisting central bank digital currency. That being said, you know, we are perfectly capable of setting up our own. I mean, what is money? I mean, money is just a system. It's a medium of exchange. If the only thing that really qualifies what counts as money is our agreement that that's money. We can agree that anything's money. We could agree that tins of mackerel are money. I mean, we can create our own systems of exchange. And I suggest that if they start rolling out central bank digital currency, that will be very important to do that, because using central bank digital currency is a red line that I'm personally not going to cross, and I would strongly advise and hope that others wouldn't either. But nonetheless, what do we do then? How do we trade? How do we buy the goods and services that we need from each other? Then certainly, you know, cryptocurrencies could play a big part of that. They could. I mean, obviously there are risks with that, because that is also an internet online kind of exchange system, which can be interfered with and shut down. And there's already been a lot of kind of people talking about, you know, the extent to which Bitcoin particularly might be a bit of a useless thing to use. But nonetheless, you know, these kind of ideas, I think rather than focus on one specific, like Bitcoin or Ethereum or what, you know, rather than is to focus on the principle that underpins it, which is, in this case, decentralized system of exchange. That is useful.
In a couple other podcasts I was just watching featuring you, I think it was with Marty Bent and with Hugo Kruger, the phrase multipolar world came up. And can you define what that is?
Yeah, I mean, the multipolar world, the idea of it's been presented really, I mean, the leaders of that are obviously China and the Russian governments and the BRICS as well, Brazil, India, South America as well. The idea is to challenge what we might consider to be and we often hear our politicians say it, the international rules-based system, which so far some people call the unipolar model, which has been based largely upon American hegemony, militarily and monetarily. So, the power of the dollar is just as important, if not more so, than America's ability to project its military power. And that has backed up a Western-led model. The argument coming from the multipolar side of the argument, which we're now looking to the east, more to the east than the west, is that global governance should be more multilateral. So there should be more players involved in the decision-making and so forth. But they're still talking about global governance. China and Russia are leading on central bank digital currency. So that the components that are, from our perspective, from the public's perspective, the components of the unipolar model, which are perhaps most concerning, there's no reason, a multipolar world is not going to change that. We're still going to have the digital panopticon. We're still going to have the fourth industrial revolution. We're still going to have AI-controlled digital ID, central bank digital currency, and all the other stuff that not many people want. So that doesn't make any difference. Whether or not the multipolar model of global governance might reduce tensions somewhat, it might. That's a possibility. There's not a lot of sign of that at the moment, is there? I mean, it's not started off very well. So everything's up. The advocates for it would say that it will reduce geopolitical tensions potentially. I think that's debatable. Personally, I think that's debatable. So that's what the multipolar world order is. It's an alternative that is on the table, something that the Chinese and Russian governments have spoke about, to the way that the world has operated really in the post-war period, really, since Bretton Woods, really.
Do you have any comments on what's going on with the rollout of the 15-minute cities everywhere all at once?
Well, I mean, we see this all the time. This is why I think it's really important that people grasp that global governance has already arrived. It's already here. So you can't coordinate something like 15-minute cities on a global scale without global governance. You need it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to do it. I mean, we even hear it down to the language that our politicians, that our political leaders use. They use the same language, build back better. Whatever they might want to say, they use the same terms, sustainable development, everything. It's all coming from a centralized, I would say, policy, a policy hub that as are described as a global public-private partnership that creates policy agendas as trajectories for where the policy's got to head. And then that is disseminated out, and national governments, they kind of decide how that would best fit their national population. But the trajectory is the same. The trajectory is the same in the States as it is in the UK, as it is in Germany, as it is in China. It's the same. It's just how the government can convince their population to go along with it. So the arguments that they would make in Germany, for example, will be very different from the arguments that they would make in China. But that's all it comes down to. It's selling the policy package, and local and the national government is best placed to sell the policy package to their population.
In the show notes, I'm going to put a link to your Sustainable Debt Slavery series, your Twitter feed, your website. If it's okay with you, I'll put the slides for this presentation, a copy of those on my Substack. Very good. Any other points you'd like to make before we wrap this one up?
Oh, no, I'd just like to thank you very much for having me on. It's been great. Nice to be able to present it. And I just hope that people will share this and more importantly, share the information and talk to other people about the reality of sustainable development, because it is not. And I would advise anybody to just dig into the sources that are in the articles. Everything is linked in the articles. So you can click on that, go and read those documents for yourself. Because when you read the documents, you then see it. Because funnily enough, everything that I've spoken about here today is openly admitted in those documents. It is openly stated in those documents. So just go and have a look for yourself.
All right. Yeah, that was a great presentation. I like to think of myself as informed, but I learned a lot. So thank you very much.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on.
Talk to you next time. Iain Davis. Goodbye.